All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started now. Hi everyone, thank you all for being here and welcome to the Clean Water Conversation series. My name is Julie Rastelli and I use she, her pronouns. I'm an Eco-AmeriCorps member serving with the Clean Water Initiative program at the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, and I'll be facilitating today's conversation. Our speakers today are Nina Gage and Ryan Patch from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. They'll be discussing the intersection of improving water quality and climate resilience on farms in Vermont. Our next clean water conversation is on Thursday, August 1st at 12 p.m., where DEC staff will discuss ARPA-funded clean water projects and initiatives, including wastewater pretreatment, the 3-acre permit attainment assistance program, and the Green Schools Initiative. The link to register will be added to the chat at the end of today's presentation. Today's conversation will begin with a presentation from our speakers, followed by a question and answer period at the very end. You can write your questions in the chat, and I'll read them during the Q&A, or you can raise your hand during the Q&A to verbally ask your question. This conversation is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. With that, I will turn it over to our speakers.
Thanks, Julia. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm going to share some slides in a second, but before I do so, it'd be great to learn a little bit more about our audience. If folks are willing to just introduce yourself with your name and your organization, and if you choose sort of why you're here today, that'll give Ryan and I a little bit of an opportunity to just know a little bit more about who we're speaking with this afternoon. And I will admit to all on the call that Julia had us scheduled to provide this presentation now almost 2 weeks past, and the day that was intended to happen turned out to be not a great day for Vermont. I'm learning that while July has nice weather and good growing conditions, it can also be a time where we continue to experience some pretty intense weather impacts. So we drafted this presentation. We discussed what we wanted to share before the most recent flooding has impacted large areas of Vermont. So just keep that in mind. It wasn't our intention, and it was no one's intention for there to be widespread flooding again for the second year in a row in July, but alas, here we are. So we'll add some context to what that means for us in our work as we go through, but the kind of primary goal is to talk a little bit more broadly about climate and water quality and Vermont agriculture. So with that, just to give an introduction, my name is Nina Gage. I'm the Assistant Director in the Division of Water Quality. I've been working at the Agency of Ag for about 7 or 8 years, and through that time, I've learned a lot about how to work with farms in Vermont. I grew up in Brandon in central Vermont, so Vermont is near and dear to my heart, as is swimming in the river after work and all things that come with those joys that we get to enjoy here in Vermont. Ryan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Patch, Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, Climate Land Use Policy Manager there. Looking forward to the conversation today.
So our hope for this lunch hour here on Monday is to talk about the intersection of improving water quality and greenhouse gas mitigation on farms in Vermont. And in order for us to have that conversation, we have to talk a lot about the context of agriculture in Vermont. So that's really where we're going to start. Ryan's going to go through some agricultural land use trends as well as climate change risks for agriculture. We'll talk through some of the emissions considerations and water quality considerations that we see in the agricultural landscape. And then we'll spend some time talking about the work that we do to try to make things better for all of us. And really farmers get all the credit for that. And then we'll talk a little bit about things beyond water and climate in our work. Ryan and I are going to do this presentation together, and just to keep it easy, we're going to sort of swap screens. So I apologize if there's a moment where you see folks' faces. It's intentional. So bear with us as we transition back and forth.
Great, thanks. Are folks seeing a photo of the State House?
Good to go.
Yep, great.
Yes.
Thank you. So just providing a bit of context for what Vermont used to look like in the 1880s, about 84% of the state of Vermont was used for farming, and there were over 30,000 farms in the state. Today, that hillside looks a lot different, with that hillside having returned to forest. This is a map showing the distribution of different types of land uses across Vermont. For context, about 80% in forest and wetlands, 12% in agriculture back in 2016, with major concentrations of agricultural activity in Champlain Valley, Addison County, and Franklin County, as well as up in Orleans County as the major nexus of land use areas in the state. However, land use has changed since 2016 and 2017. Agriculture in Vermont is currently managing around 540,000 acres of both cropland and pasture land. So just 9% of the state of Vermont's terrestrial land base is used for farming. It's been in decline since the end of World War II. And when looking against other types of land use in Vermont, agriculture is the one in retreat. We have two different scales on this chart here. The millions are for agriculture and forestry. The 100,000s are for total mapped wetlands and urban land in Vermont. And so post World War II, as agriculture has receded, forests have made a recovery, wetlands as well, and urban land continues to increase its footprint across the state of Vermont. For context, this is based on the 2022 USDA Mass Ag Census. Farmers manage a lot more than just cropland and pasture in Vermont. When you compare woodland with cropland and pasture, it's pretty much co-equal. There's a couple hundred acres of forest land that farmers manage and beyond cropland and pasture. So the statement can be farmers manage as much forest land as they do farmland in Vermont. So that's just another important piece of context. So agriculture has been decreasing its footprint in the state over the years, and climate change has been increasing in prominence as an issue that is forecast to affect farmers, as well as is actively affecting farmers more and more as the years and seasons roll on. We know from the Vermont Climate Assessment conducted by University of Vermont that Vermont is getting both warmer and wetter, and there are numerous hazards that are projected to increase and risks are projected to increase as climate change advances. Extreme rain is predicted as being one of the largest potential impacts to Vermont. We're seeing that more and more. Hurricanes as a high climate risk, and water stress as well. Remember, it's not just the amount of rainfall, but the distribution of rainfall, and episodic droughts and droughts in the summer are predicted to become more common. Wildfires will increase as well as heat stress. However, sea level rise is not one of those that are predicted to affect Vermont, but as we'll talk about in a moment or later on in the presentation, New England is looking at this impact a bit more acutely. What's on the screen here is just a bunch of details, but what's attempted to be communicated are the federal disaster declarations that were made in a 13-month period between 2022 and 2024. There were 6 discrete disasters that affected farmers as well as numerous other landowners and citizens of Vermont, but it just shows the potential intensity of damage as well as the variety of damage. We have a freeze in May, flooding in July, flooding in December, a windstorm in January. To focus on one of the acute climate disasters from last year, the flooding in July, we saw widespread flooding throughout Vermont. For the agricultural sector, all types of operations were affected. All different sizes of farms were affected. About 70% anticipated negative cash flow within 6 to 12 months or some other time period. So significant deleterious economic effects for the farmers, and 70% of respondents did not have crop or livestock insurance. When you look at the scale of damage between agricultural producers and then other components of the food system, between $44 and $69 million of damage. The amounts of money from state and philanthropic have increased a bit, and USDA through FSA has made some payments as well, but less than 20% of the damages have been compensated for agriculture at this point in time. So a lot of farmers are experiencing significant negative economic impacts. And as we saw last week, the rate, or 2 weeks ago, the rate and increase of these disasters can pick up, and farmers are going to be significantly impacted as climate change continues to pick up in intensity. Nina, I'll throw it back to you.
Thanks, Ryan. Deep breath. So I have to comment that we were working very hard with our team over the course of the last week and the weekend to roll out a new impact and assessment survey to capture damages from this most recent flooding event. So that's now up and live on our website. If folks have neighbors or work with farms, we're advising folks to respond to that survey at this point in time so that we can capture an understanding of what this most recent event has caused in terms of impacts to our food system and to our agricultural producers in Vermont. So this, again, I mentioned we crafted this presentation before our most recent flooding events. This is a photo from the July 2023 floods. And you can see there's a couple of individuals in the corner here to give you a little sense of the scale. The issues that we see as a result of flooding, specifically in Vermont, range from lost crops to field damage to, in this most recent event, to the loss of life of individuals. I think something for folks to just be reminded of in our communities and in Vermont is that our farm fields lie along the rivers. They tend to be some of the first places to flood, and they tend to be some areas that withstand significant damage. We all hope that our communities and our community centers and everyone's homes are safe. So in that way, you could ask, is it better that a farm field floods than a community center? And I think most would respond yes. At the same time, I think that we as Vermonters just have to keep in mind what that means, that our farmers are the ones whose fields flood first, and what that means in terms of our response. This was, again, we see crop loss, we see field damage, we see edge of field damage, and we see our rivers move. And this is, I think, an area that we're continuing to be able to better communicate, what I think many folks feel is normal. You talk to your grandfather, you talk to your neighbors about what happened during this flood, and we see farmers say, this has never happened to this field before, right? We're reaching a sense of newness that just seems more raw than it has in previous events. So that is a really, really fascinating space to both work with farmers and to communicate with farmers about what that means for them and their businesses and their production. So in some cases, it means that fields that farmers would never consider taking out of production, they may be willing to have that conversation as they lose their crops for the second year in a row on the same fields. And at the same time, I think, what Ryan shared in the beginning, which is that we've seen a pretty significant change in land use in Vermont and really a decline of agricultural land. We're faced with the question of, well, what other land areas are available to farm, right? If you are a member of a CSA this summer, you may have received some notices in the past couple of weeks about what your CSA is likely to look like as Vermonters and as people benefiting from food production in our communities, what that really means. One thing to note and be aware of that is somewhat unique to agricultural impacts and just produce in general is that if floodwaters interact with food that's meant for human consumption, it's deemed on under federal law, the Food Safety Modernization Act, it can no longer be sold. So what that essentially means is any crops that interact with floodwaters are not eligible to be sold, right? It's essentially the farmer has to take a loss from those products. So yeah, just some photos to share from last year's flood, and I apologize, I'm sort of interspersing some information based on this most recent event as we navigate to respond and support farmers to recover.
Thanks. Nina, I think it's great context to underscore the push and pull dynamics of the geography of Vermont and how it affects our land use settlement patterns and what a change in climate means for historic land uses in those areas, such as agriculture and farming. To talk about the nexus of the state of Vermont's clean water efforts, as well as implementation of the Global Warming Solutions Act, at the heart of both of those approaches, whether it's the total maximum daily load for phosphorus or the greenhouse gas emission inventory for the state of Vermont, there are regulatory targets that are set out there with reductions that are required by multiple different sectors. And just as agriculture is a share of the contribution under the total maximum daily load for phosphorus for Lake Champlain or Magog or other impaired waters in the state, there similarly are tabulations for emissions for agriculture in the greenhouse gas quantification space, as well as emission reduction requirements in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so to describe the rubric for tracking greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, it's going to take a little bit of a deep dive. It's a brief, there's a lot more to this conversation, but to try to sketch up when we say emissions from agriculture, what does that mean in the context of the Global Warming Solutions Act? It's going to take just a couple moments here to dig into the science and the tools that are used to quantify emissions. So these are 4 big categories of emissions for agriculture: enteric fermentation, belching of cows or other ruminant animals, how manure is stored, if it is stored, so a manure pit, composting, or other storage, what happens when manure fertilizer is spread on fields, as well as any nitrous oxide losses from crops that are grown. And then on the converse, the sequestration potential of soils, right? The photosynthesis and the carbon cycle, plants take in CO2 and can work to sequester carbon in soils. And in some ways, the flux can be negative, meaning a positive sequestration rate, and in others, it can be an emission. So management matters when it comes to how to tabulate whether a particular acre of land is emitting or sequestering, but just to acknowledge that there is the potentiality from an acre of land for both emissions and removals and or sequestration. So thinking about those 4 sources, we then look to the greenhouse gas emission inventory for the state of Vermont, and agriculture is tagged with 15.8% of the emissions that Vermont has are attributable to agriculture. When we dig into how that 15.8% is tabulated, the modeling tool, which the EPA provides, called the State Inventory Tool, is broken up into 2 chapters, both the State Inventory Tool, Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. And Chapter 5 is looking at the gross emissions from agriculture. And so it is important to provide some context that this 15.8% is the gross emissions from agriculture and does not include the sequestration potential of soils or other management that can be applied to increase the rate of soil carbon accumulation. To look at change over time for this share of emissions, we can see in 1990, the baseline for many of the reduction requirements in the GWSA 1.24 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. In 2020, it was 1.26. So back pretty much to where Vermont started. However, as we'll see, there are some major changes that have happened in the ag industry, and that will speak to some research that was done to better investigate how to tabulate agricultural emissions. Half of emissions from the agricultural sector are attributable to enteric fermentation, mostly the belching of cows. Manure management and the storage of it is about a quarter. Ag soils are about a quarter, and then a very small percentage of emissions in Vermont are attributable to liming and nitrogen fertilizer. For dairy, even though cows are emitting, they are substituting a lot of need for fertilizer, as the fertilizer produced at the back end, the manure, does provide a significant share of the nutrients that a farmer needs to grow their crops. It's important to kind of call out how this emission inventory is tabulated. On the cow side, you're mostly just looking at the number of cows, the type of cow, how large they are, if they're producing milk, how much milk they produce. Manure storage is the type of storage, the amount stored, and the duration. Ag soils are when manure is directly applied, what happens to that? When cows directly drop it on pasture, what happens to that manure? As well as some on the nitrogen fixing and crops. But the point is, it's mostly focused on number of cows, right? That's a big driver of this. If the factors that you can change are the number of cows, the size of the cow, milk production values, there's not room for management in this framework to affect the rate of emission. And as we'll talk about, there are numerous conservation practices that agriculture can and has been adopting, which has a positive influence on the rate of emission or the positive rate of sequestration. So this is that distribution of types of emission sources across Vermont going back to 1990. If you look at the history of livestock and dairy farming in Vermont, we know in 1992 there were close to 300,000 cows, and we're down to about 250,000 cows in 2017. We've lost 60,000 acres, but we've increased about 200 million pounds of milk over that time frame. And so even though gross emissions from all sources are about the same as we were in 1992, Vermont is producing more milk than it was. So it is, in part and parcel to what the EPA recommends in their non-CO2 emission analysis for agriculture globally, which is intensification is a strategy to get the same amount of food or more food from the same climate emissions. And so that is what's played out in Vermont over the past, 29, 30 years or so. But that leaves a challenge then if it's mostly a factor of how many cows, their size, how much milk they produce, how manure is stored. There's only one conservation practice or management strategy that a farmer could adopt that can be reflected in that EPA state inventory tool, and that's digesters. Taking the methane or biogas that comes off of these manure pits and destroying them, either turning it into electricity or renewable natural gas. This provides a climate emission reduction and is currently the only opportunity Vermont Agriculture has in the formal inventory to reduce the emissions of one of these categories. But we know from the work of the Climate Council and the Ag Ecosystem Subcommittee that there are many strategies that can reduce on a net basis and go to that definition of mitigation, which is the opportunity to both reduce emissions as well as increase the rate of sequestration in soils. And so at each step, whether you're working with the cow, mitigation strategies include changing the types of diet or grazing. For when you're looking at manure storage, you can look at how long that manure is stored. Grazing is a way to distribute it better, or to compost some of that manure, as well as mitigation strategies in the field, which speak to the same principles of improving soil health that water quality follows as far as advancing improvements in environmental outcomes for water quality. As Nina will talk to in great detail, there are also benefits for the climate from the mitigation perspective. And so in the EPA state inventory tool, they do have two chapters, right? One focused on gross ag emissions, and then the other, as I mentioned, on the soils themselves. And so the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change back in 2006 recommended to take agriculture and its soils and put them together into a new sector called ag forestry and other land uses. This was a recommendation of the AR5, the revision before the most recent one. EPA took note of this and said these changes will likely be incorporated in the next round of revisions to the state inventory tool modules. Unfortunately, those recommendations and guidance have not been adopted at the national level, and so the Climate Council directed or said, please research this. ANR led the way to get some grant funding from the U.S. Climate Alliance and coordinated with us here at the Agency of Ag to review the greenhouse gas emission inventory tool for agriculture to better understand, how to integrate those recommendations from 2006, should they be integrated, et cetera. ICF is the contractor which conducts the state inventory tool updates for EPA. And they recommend that the state inventory tool is the best suited available tool for Vermont to develop a state level inventory. And so after looking at many other modeling options, state inventory tool is still the best for the state level. However, they recommend here that removal from ag lands, as estimated by the land use change and forestry module, can be reported alongside greenhouse gas estimates from the ag module. So putting those two together makes sense, as well as to capture not just the rate of accumulation in soils, but management practices in addition to that. Comet Planner is a USDA greenhouse gas emission reduction coefficient modeling tool, which can help to quantify the benefits of land use practices farmers adopt that have those greenhouse gas reduction benefits or coefficient benefits. Anyway, the conclusion is, Vermont is now one of the leading states in exploring means of customizing the AFOLW greenhouse gas inventory to support the emissions and removal policy decisions. We're one of the few states looking at this, and so it's something as we work with other departments of agriculture in the region to better understand this. This is an area of refinement that is being explored, not just in Vermont now, but many other places. So just to try to simplify the policy discussions that are happening around this, there's an opportunity to do what the Intergovernmental IPCC said as far as the framework, which is the sequestration from the ag soils, and then including the ag conservation practices and their role in soil carbon sequestration could be the equation for better quantifying emissions from the ag, forestry, and other land use sector. And so that's work that will be ongoing and something that could be reflected in future emission inventories that are put out of state. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Nina, for next section.
Thanks, Ryan. If you haven't picked it up already, quantifying and calculating greenhouse gas emissions is complex. And luckily we have Ryan to help us understand the interworkings of those processes. I'm going to speak briefly about how we quantify water quality impacts from agriculture, specifically in the Lake Champlain Basin. So the Lake Champlain Basin program releases a report every few years called the State of the Lake Report, and I borrowed their graphic to share with you all this afternoon because I really like the simplicity of it. But I think the key piece here is that not only are the components of environmental impact important, but the land area and the load per acre are all really important considerations when you're talking about calculating environmental impacts from a sector. So when we look at water quality specifically in the Lake Champlain Basin, we see primarily that developed lands they contribute more phosphorus on a per acre basis than other land uses. So this orange is developed lands, yellow is agriculture, Wetlands and forests are other sectors included in this figure in the center. If we go over to the left, we can see that, well, yes, we know Vermont is primarily forested. So not only are you taking the load into account, you're taking the land area of any sector. And then our takeaway here is that agriculture has a really high contribution to our water quality impacts in Lake Champlain Basin. And part of that is because of the amount of land in agriculture, and part of that is because the amount of loading that any acre of agricultural production provides, right, or creates. When we look a little bit closer, we look specifically at agriculture. There's a couple other things to keep in mind. Agriculture is one word for an entire land use sector and industry. When we look closer at agriculture, where are we seeing losses come from within the agricultural sector? Primarily, we see these coming from cropland. So this is land areas that are growing crops. And as Ryan alluded to in the beginning part of the presentation, most of the cropland in Vermont is hayland. We have a pretty small amount of actually like annual cropland. It's about 90,000 acres of annual cropland compared to about 600,000 acres of agricultural land. So while we know our losses are coming from cropland, a large amount of them are widely dispersed haylands across the whole state. We have a smaller percentage coming from pasture land and then production areas. Production areas refers to like the main farm, homestead, or barn, right? So we have a high concentration of nutrient storage, anything from manure storage to feed storage. So while it's a small percentage of our overall loading from ag, it's got a high loading rate, but it's just because it's a small land area. Like when we compare it to, right, all of the cropland in Vermont, for instance. So just to give you some context to like how we look at understanding the calculations behind impacts to water from agriculture. So what does that mean for our work? What does that mean for what we use public support to incentivize and promote? What we really try to do in the Agency of Agriculture and the Division of Water Quality is provide technical and financial assistance. At the end of the day, we want to support farms to make the right decisions for their land. And in some cases, that decision can look really different from one field to the next or one farm to the next. So just like I showed those photos, like your impact from flooding can be really different from one field to the next. The recommendations for improving water quality on one field can be really different from one field to the next and from one farm to the next, depending on what they're producing, the type of livestock that they manage. There was a survey effort done as part of the Payment for Ecosystem Services Working Group in 2022 that shared this fact, which is that 94% of Vermont farmers believe they have the knowledge and skill to enhance soil health on their farm, yet only 58% have the financial capacity to do so. So, part of our role is providing incentives to support behavior change in a way that we as the public sector and as Vermont wants to see, right? If we want to incentivize or change behavior in one direction or another, we find it incredibly valuable to incentivize that behavior. So I just want to talk briefly through some of the strategies that we work with farms to improve water quality. And many of these strategies, they don't just provide a benefit for improving water quality, they also provide other benefits. Sometimes those are benefits to the community, sometimes those are benefits for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. When we talk about this, we use the word conservation practices, so I just want to state that plainly. They're often also referred to as best management practices. So these are the terms that we use to define strategies for working with farms to improve the environment. I'm going to start with a simple one, and I'm going to talk about these and just know that there is a much longer list and suite of strategies and practices. So I tried to focus on some key ones that we really have seen both incredible uptake of over the last 10 years in Vermont by Vermont farmers, as well as practices that really offer a super solid co-benefit when it comes to improving water and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So cover crops. Cover crops are typically planted after a crop is harvested. So what that means is a farm might plant a crop and plan on selling that crop for a market. And then once that happens, the cover crop is essentially an additional crop. So they're looking to cover seed costs, diesel costs, labor costs, to implement an additional planting that basically they have no market for. They're not selling. The sole benefit of planting a cover crop in many cases is to cover the soil. So just like we see the benefit of covered soil when it comes to water quality, it also provides a massive sequestration benefit, right? If we can plant crops that use nutrients to grow, they offer us a really awesome benefit for water quality. So I have to give a caveat here, which is that we have baseline rates for water quality in Vermont. So we see about a 28% reduction in phosphorus runoff, and that's compared to a situation in which they're not growing cover crop. And then there's a great reduction in greenhouse gas benefits, and we talk about those in tons per acre per year in carbon dioxide equivalents. So you guys can all remember that. We're going to quiz you at the end. The next practice I'll speak to briefly is called rotational grazing. So you might see cows in fields. That's not necessarily rotational grazing. So rotational grazing is really a management intensive practice where cows are being rotated really often from one pasture to another. And in a lot of cases, it's from one paddock or one small area of a field to another small area of a field. And what that really does is you're intensively grazing a space, but you're also allowing that space a certain amount of time to rest and regrow both the grass species and the soil structure. And that rest period can range depending on the time of year. So your rest periods that you need for a pasture in, let's say, July are going to look really different depending on heat and moisture, with a rest period that's defined for, let's say, the month of August or the month of September, when you get towards the end of the growing season and you don't see that same regrowth. Compared to just stocking animals on a field that doesn't get rotated, we see a 24% reduction in phosphorus runoff as a result of rotational grazing. And it also offers a benefit for reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for both the perennial vegetated part, but also the benefits can often be for cow health and management in terms of the enteric fermentation process that's happening within a cow. But other grazed animals, right, that we do rotational grazing with can include sheep and goats. So there's lots of opportunity for rotational grazing. I think the biggest thing for farms is that it requires a lot of infrastructure that may not already be in place. So sometimes that's fencing, sometimes that's temporary fencing that can be moved to create those paddocks. And in other cases, it's water sources. So there's a variety of sort of planning efforts and changes that need to be made at an infrastructure level to support a farm to go from just allowing cows in a field to management intensive rotational grazing. Conservation tillage. So this is a term or a practice that talks about basically reducing the amount of tillage in a field. And really the goal is to reduce the amount of soil disturbance. This has benefits for reducing erosion or sediment runoff, as well as like improving the retention. So the sponge factor, we'll call it, of a field to both hold water when we get big rainstorms or floods. And we see about a 20% reduction in runoff as a result of conservation tillage. And that's compared to intensively tilling the field, which is sort of what I would consider like the standard agricultural practices of most of our grandparents growing up in our lifetimes. The rate of change by which we've seen farms in Vermont adopt both reducing tillage and cover cropping practices on cropland has been incredible. And I think a lot of that has to go just to support the concept that farmers at the end of the day understand what protecting soil means. And sometimes protecting soil is in our eyes, keeping soil on the field, right? And that's really well known and appreciated by almost every farm I've ever interacted with. And this practice also provides an incredible benefit for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So similarly, filter strips are a term that's used to talk about the land area along the edge of the field. You can call them buffer strips, riparian buffers. The term filter strips is really specific to agriculture in that it's typically grass. We really love to see grass buffers that farms care for, just like their hay fields. So I think we've all experienced the types of buffers that can exist along field edges that are not necessarily well taken care of. So I really love convincing and working with farms on filter strips because I know that they're going to care for those land areas just like they care for their core and their hay fields and their livestock areas. See a massive benefit, 40% reduction in phosphorus runoff when you convert a field from being cropland into having this perennial buffer for this land area, and it offers a really massive benefit for greenhouse gas emissions as well. The last one I'll mention, so similarly to filter strips, you can also take land out of production and plant trees in that area. I think one consideration is that you're taking that land out of production, and as Ryan alluded, we've seen a huge decline in ag land. So when and if a producer is willing, we will work with them to take land out of production and plant them into riparian buffers. And these are really awesome. They have an incredible filtering capacity for runoff edge of fields. But as you can imagine, sometimes a farm might be more likely or willing to implement a filter strip that they can manage as hay in lieu of losing that land altogether. And at the same time, there's a lot of farms that really appreciate riparian forest buffers along streams and rivers on their property for a variety of reasons. And riparian forest buffers, because they have trees, can offer a pretty substantial increase in reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And they also offer a really, really incredible benefit for improving water quality, not only in reduction in phosphorus, but also just the conversion of the land from crop or hay into forested buffers. So that's just a few of the practices that we work with farms to implement. And in some cases, we provide technical assistance, and in other cases, we provide financial assistance. But the name of the game really at the end of the day is to both incentivize and support behavior change, and to incentivize and support farmers to innovate. Sometimes we have the answers, and sometimes farms come up with new solutions that nobody in government really thought of before. So we operate about 10 financial assistance programs, and we support between 50 and 70,000 acres of improvements on an annual basis. So we work with a lot of farms, and we work to implement a lot of practices. And the cool piece is that a lot of these practices not only offer benefits for water quality, but they also offer benefits for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. One of the things I'll just mention, and then I'm going to hand it back over to Ryan, is since we started publishing an annual clean water performance report, agriculture has played a pretty big role. So, we talked at the beginning about how much of the piece of the pie agriculture has when it comes to water quality impacts in the Lake Champlain Basin. And we have TMDLs in multiple watersheds in Vermont. So specifically, the Lake Champlain Basin is a very large land area. We also have phosphorus requirements in the Lake Memphremagog Basin. And in both of these watersheds, we've really seen agriculture as a sector not only, maybe cause a lot of the impacts, but also provide the state with a large opportunity to make improvements. So agriculture has provided between 80 to 90%, depending on the year, of the overall estimated reduction in phosphorus loading, both in the Lake Champlain and the Lake Memphremagog Basin. So I think it's important to understand how big of a role agriculture plays in our environmental issues, and also to respect that in many cases, this is based on individual landowners and stewards making a decision about their land base that benefits Vermont.
Thank you, Nina. I'm going to run through the last couple slides here quickly so we can get to answering some questions. On the converse, as far as the opportunity for greenhouse gas mitigation benefits, this is the co-benefit that can be quantified from those conservation practices farmers have adopted for water quality purposes. If the state were to use comment planner to also count the net sequestration benefit from those conservation practices, there are many tens of thousands of tons of CO2 equivalent per year that are putting more CO2 equivalents in the soil and storing it there. And that's really where a significant amount of opportunity exists. This is a research project from University of Vermont Extension, the state of soil health, statewide soil sampling, and the opportunity is quite great. The Vermont farmers are managing their organic matter better than the rest of the country. And there's still opportunity to increase soil carbon accumulation in the top foot of ag soils. That potential is the potential to have an annual soil carbon sequestration rate that is the same as removing the emissions from 200,000 cars. So there's real power in ag soils if the state and farmers continue to invest in soil building on farms. Over 19 years, the state could go from 4.3% soil organic matter to 6%. Now I'm going to transition for just 3 minutes to talk about a little bit beyond climate change and water quality, or focusing on climate resilience and why farmers are farming by and large, which is the provisioning of food. Nina shared this slide and this talking point. Suffice it to say, farmers have a high level of stewardship ethic and are motivated to be a part of improving soil health and being a part of climate solutions. This is from the UVM State of Soil Health, which shows that Vermont on average has a 4.3% soil organic matter, which is higher than the national average. If you have higher organic matter, you can infiltrate more water when it rains. And if you have more organic matter, you have more drought resilience. But it's important to talk about the difference between stressors and shocks. A mild drought compared to 7 inches of rainfall in 24 hours, there isn't a lot of resilience work that can be done for kind of that scale of localized flooding that may occur. And totally intact forest watersheds having significant erosion speak to some of the challenges and some of the climate shocks that are going to be coming. And so trying to introduce a topic of a more higher level or broader discussion about what does climate resilience mean when looking at the food system. And so introduce this kind of projected climate risk chart looking at Vermont. And I wanted to just take a look at the region. Remember, Vermont did not have sea level rise as a predicted threat. However, when you look at New England, the coastline, of course, is potentially going to be significantly impacted by a rising sea level. And when you overlay on the left-hand side here, this new map, this is the population density of New England. And so where the vast majority of the people live is where this sea level rise is going to be occurring. This is and so that I think behooves Vermont to do some planning for what does climate migration look like. This is work from American Farmland Trust, which looks at the current pace and rate of development and the conversion of ag soils to develop uses. And by 2040, they are predicting between 40 and 60,000 acres of farmland will be converted to some degree of development. And so the threats that, relative safety of Vermont, but also weighted against the fact that other areas of the country where the majority of the food products are produced are going to have significant obstacles to adapting to some of the extreme heat, water stress, and wildfires in the regions that they're farming. But the Northeast is an area where there is a relative amount, a good amount of precipitation and temperature, where the cultivation of food and crops is going to be more possible. And so New England Feeding New England is a New England Food System Planners Partnership 30 by 30 concept, which asks the question, can the 6 New England states provide 30% of their food from regional farms and fisheries by 2030? At the best possible estimate, the maximal amount New England is at now is 21%. So to go from 21% to 30% by 2030, it would take about 400,000 acres of existing underutilized cropland being farmed more intensively, as well as 590,000 acres of new cropland would need to be brought into production. And in the plan, they discussed the different types of crops that will need to be grown to meet regional food demand. And the last context I want to introduce here is the ag census for Vermont, for the most recent one, says there's 540,000 acres of land used for growing food and crops in Vermont. This 30 by 30 plan, now they don't say it all has to happen in Vermont, obviously, but across Maine and Vermont are the 2 states that are identified of where this expansion would need to happen. And so to go from 21% to 30%, the talking point could be you have to double the size of Vermont agriculture, right? But agriculture is in decline. And so balancing not only the environmental benefits that farmers are engaged with and are providing through clean water avenues, there's a significant opportunity to help the state meet its Global Warming Solutions Act emission reduction requirements, as well as this broader concept and discussion that's needed around the role of food security in future climate change planning and programming. And so here's Nina and my contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Nina, I'll throw it back to you for any closing remarks.
Thanks, Ryan. I think at this point, Julia, we'll turn it back to you. I'm happy to answer some questions that participants may have for us. And I really appreciate everyone's attention today during this lunch hour. Really appreciate you being here and hopefully picked up some good tidbits of information. I know we shared a lot of information, and I apologize. It's really difficult to share trends and strategies without talking about some of the context behind the programs that we run and the services that we offer.
Great, thank you both for presenting. I just pasted some links in the chat from today's conversation, and then we have a few minutes if anyone has any questions.
Sylvia can go ahead.
Sylvia, you're on mute. Sylvia, let me help you out and I'll unmute you from my end. Hold on a second. Julia, are you able to unmute her? Oh, there we go. Okay.
I got it. Okay, so I wanted
Thanks.
to ask, I've heard about a fair amount of pesticide use on killing cover crops in the spring. Is that still part of the cover crop program? And what does that have to do with it? Does that govern the farmer's access to insurance for his crop?
So I can't speak to private insurance requirements, but I will just add that there are a variety of methods to terminate a cover crop in the springtime and prepare a field for planting. The state does not require a farm to utilize herbicides, and we do not financially support a farm to utilize herbicides. It is one of multiple methods that a farmer may employ to terminate a cover crop in the springtime and prepare a field for planting.
Is there any kind of recommendation one way or another? Because of, when you're using herbicide in the springtime when there's less vegetation to keep it from running off, you get more problems in the lake. There are herbicides getting into Lake Champlain, so I'm just wondering. And also, I think the herbicides damage the soil's ability to sequester CO2. So, what is your department's thinking on those?
Thank you for your
measurement. We know from measurement of ag fields that are under the management you're describing that there are positive rates of soil carbon accumulation that have been documented in that type of management.
I missed part of what you said, Ryan. It went by pretty fast, and the hearing.
Sorry, just the state of soil health, which is a report that's linked in this presentation and made available. If you look that up, you can investigate the soil health data that's available for different types of management. It's broken out not just by farming, but different types of crops. And taking a look in there, you'll see summary information which points to the fields that were sampled that are under the type of management you were describing do have positive rates of soil carbon accumulation. So we are seeing all types of farmers that are able to increase their soil health regardless of the type of management compared to a baseline management without any conservation practices.
All right. Thank you.
John, if you'd like to ask your question now.
Yeah, I guess my first comment would be, I wish I left more time for questions. I agree with Sylvia. The pesticides killing the cover crops are definitely a problem for lake quality. My question and concern is about the floodplains. It's distressing to hear the level of flooding and its harm that's done through the flooding for agriculture, but also for water quality. And I'm familiar with the Burlington Intervale, which has been flooding for decades. I grew up right near there. It's not something new, it's something old. And the crops keep getting ruined almost every year, it seems. What's the state's position on taking some of these floodplains that are used for ag out of production and the state purchasing the land? I think that would be just a huge improvement. And I can't imagine how farmers keep planting, especially vegetables, in fields that have been overflown with PFAS and PFOS and contaminants and pollution and human sewage.
Yeah.
I know you test, but there's got to be something wrong with that. So first of all, what are they doing about purchasing these frequented floodplains, not the ones that are very occasional, but ones like the Burlington Intervale?
I can start, and Ryan, please feel free to add to the response. So just to speak specifically, Mr. Barrows, regarding programs that are offered through the Division of Water Quality, we have a few staff who administer a program called the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. This is a quasi state and federal program. It's administered as a collaborative between the state of Vermont, the USDA Farm Service Agency, and the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. So we essentially compensate farmers for taking certain lands out of production to plant them into riparian buffers. There's a couple other practices that can be eligible for this program, but we do have opportunities for landowners who are interested in making that decision or making that choice to take a certain sector or a certain field out of production, or a certain portion of a field out of production, with the intent to implement a riparian forest buffer or other natural resource restoration project. So just to speak from like programs that we offer through the Division of Water Quality for farms who are willing to make that decision, we do have options.
Yeah, I've been familiar for the past almost 40 years of crop rotation and buffer strips and regenerative agriculture. I'm very familiar with all those, and you seem to be promoting them and putting a great deal of money into them, which is great. But is your response to the state and buying frequently floodplains that ag is used? It doesn't sound like the state is being aggressive in that approach. Where it sounds like it's a passive program where the farmer can choose or the owner of the land can choose. So is there something, I would think the state would want to be more aggressive, because here in Chittenden County, I see the same ag fields, floodplains flooded almost every spring. It's just a regular thing, and it can't be healthy for the food or the water quality. It's just I would like to see the state become more aggressive on that and giving more incentives to owners to give up their land and let them return to nature and become a more positive floodplain and let it back to its regular use.
The 9% of the state of Vermont is used for farming. It used to be 84%. Those fields that flood the most often, that are least viable, those farm fields have long been abandoned. When we look at the history of food production, and we look at how agriculture co-evolve with seasonal flooding and how to manage water and irrigation, that there's a natural co-evolution of agriculture and our waters. When we think about the threats that are affecting agriculture, flooding is definitely the most visible one that we have seen over the past year. Folks will remember that 2.5 years prior to the flooding that began in July of last year, it was a drought. And so access to water resources that are not affected by irrigation withdrawals, such as large main stem rivers, remain a significant strategy for a climate resilient future, where there's a vision where Vermont produces some of the food that it eats. And so I would just offer a different perspective of how do we help farmers recover that most productive land that substitutes the need to clear uplands to grow food in soils that are less suited and tolerated for the quantity of food that society needs. So offering a different perspective on management in the face of climate change and other priorities that I think farmers are considering, as well as the state should consider as well.
Brian, your comparison to in the 1800s, 90% of Vermont was clear cut. So is it better now than then? Yes, it's much better now than then. So that your comparison doesn't hold water. Today, we're dealing in the era of climate change, of frequent flooding, we're in 2024. We shouldn't be looking at it as something of preserving floodplains that are frequently flooded that cause water quality damage. I think it sounds like all I've heard today is kind of a rah-rah for the Department of Ag and how great a job we're doing. It's not really a balanced presentation, I feel.
Thank you for your concern, Mr. Barrows.
Well, I've had this concern for 30 years. Ryan knows me from Lake Carmine, where there's an environmental disaster going on there.
All right, looks like we're just over 1 o'clock. So thank you everyone for coming. You can contact Nina and Ryan with any further questions with the emails that they provided. So be on the lookout for a follow-up email with the feedback survey and the links that were dropped in the chat today. Hope everyone has a great day and hope to see you at our conversation on August 1st.
Thank you very much
for hosting,
your time.
Julia. Appreciate it.
Thanks all.
Take care, everybody.
Well done.